Hello there. Today we're going to talk about dependency injection. This is an important concept, one that we'll be using from here on out in the course. Adding dependency injection comes down to 6 steps. We're going to look at several examples, and although it might seem complicated at first, you'll soon feel very comfortable with this concept, and you should be able to add dependency injection to an application with no problems. 3 of the steps involve changing the code within a pre-existing application, and then the other 3 involve installing some software and hooking it up so that it works correctly. So again, at first this may seem fairly complicated, but it's something that you'll learn eventually hopefully by the time this video is finished, and then you'll be using it a lot, so it should become very familiar to you. Now, in order to understand dependency injection, we need to know about interfaces and how interfaces work. So I want to start this discussion by talking about the concept of the Walmart greeter. Now, these days you don't always see a greeter when you walk into Walmart, but it used to be every time you walked into a Walmart there would be someone there dressed in a vest or some kind of uniform for the store who would greet the customers coming in. And obviously their role was to basically stand there and say hi to all of the customers coming in. So we might say that the Walmart greeter is this abstract concept, but it was actually filled with real people. Real people would come, stand there, and perform that role of the greeter. Now, one of the biggest things they were supposed to do is to say hi to the guests. Now, each of them would do that in their own way because they're individual people. So although their instructions might be just say hello to the customers, each one would do that in their own way. If I were to write an application that would simulate this concept of the Walmart greeter, I might have 2 classes. I could have a friendly greeter class and a happy greeter class. Each of these would have a method called say hi, but each of these methods would be, the friendly greeter would return the string, welcome to Walmart, how are you doing today? The happy greeter would return something different. They would say, happy to see you, have a great day. So those are 2 different ways that a person might greet someone coming in. And again, we're simulating this through a computer application, so that would involve these 2 different classes returning 2 different greetings. So what is an interface? An interface is like a class, but it has no method implementations, just declarations. We'll talk about what that means here in a minute, but take a look at this in the box. It says public interface iGreeter. Now, if it were a class, it would say public class, but this says public interface. One thing that we do with interfaces in ASP.NET is start the name with a capital I. So that lets everyone know that it's an interface, not just a regular class. So we have this interface called iGreeter, and notice inside it doesn't look like those previous classes that we had. Looks really kind of strange to us, probably, if we haven't worked with interfaces before, because it says string say hi, but it doesn't then have after the say hi definition, name there, definition header, it doesn't then have a set of curly braces and then say what that method should do like those previous classes did. All it's doing is saying, hey, I'm going to have a method called say hi. That's all it's saying. It's not saying how is that method implemented? what is done inside that method when that method is executed. So that's what we mean by it has no method implementations. It's just declaring the method but not saying what exactly the method does. Now with an interface, no object is ever based upon this class, because if that were the case, the object would not know what to do with whenever that say hi method was called. So what we have to do is have other classes that have these same method names but actually include the implementations. So here again are the classes we talked about before, and those would be classes that maybe would use this interface. Notice each of these classes do have that very same method called say hi, but these are the ones that actually say what is being done inside that method. So we would say that these classes are implementations of that interface seen above. Building loosely coupled components. Now, an important feature of the MVC pattern is the separation of concerns. We've already talked about that when it comes to styling, keeping our styling separate from the content of our web pages, and we're going to continue that same idea in this setting too. What we want in this setting is that we're going to have different components, different classes performing different things, fulfilling different roles, but we want the components within our application to have as few interdependency as possible. What we'd like is we would like each component to have to know nothing about any other component. We just want each component to be separate within itself, and then only dealing with other areas of the application through what are called abstract interfaces. Okay, so we want each component just to be totally dependent and not needing to know anything about any of the other components. This is known as loose coupling, and it makes testing easier and modifying applications easier. Because if you think about it, if every component if no components depend upon any other components, then you only have to test the one component and not worry about how that's going to affect the rest of your application. Also, when it comes to modifying applications, all you have to do is go into that one component and work on it, change it, and not worry that you're going to mess everything else up within the rest of your application. So dependency injection is what helps us accomplish this. And so that's why it's so important within the context of ASP.NET MVC, is that we want loose coupling, and dependency injection helps us achieve that. If we think back to our application where we're simulating the Walmart greeter, remember we had those two classes, a friendly greeter and a happy greeter. If I, at some point within my application, if I would want to instantiate one of those classes, come up with an object based off of those classes, I'd have to have some kind of statement that looks like this. If I wanted to use happy greeter, then I would say happy greeter, my greeter equals new happy greeter. That would create a new instance of happy greeter, and I would now have an object called my greeter that's based upon the class happy greeter. Now that we would say, with having that line within our application, we would be establishing a dependency there, because we are actually have this line saying I am going to use happy greeter as opposed to the friendly greeter. So if I just mention happy greeter in my application at all anywhere, then my application is depending upon that one class called happy greeter. What we want is, we don't want that. We don't want our application to specifically say that it's going to use the happy greeter. We would like it to stay flexible. We'd like to say, okay, we're going to use some kind of greeter we want to be able to swap out happy greeter and friendly greeter easily. So within our application, we don't even want to mention which class we're going to use. Okay, so that's what loose coupling would be, is if we don't have to mention, don't have to have a line in our application that mentions which of these we're going to use. So what would we do if we want to break this dependency and instead inside our application just say, okay, we're going to use some kind of greeter. I'm not going to say which kind because we want to stay open. Well, what we'll do is we're going to take out any mention of happy greeter within the application. So we're not going to have a statement like what you see above. Instead, what we're going to do is we're going to have an interface, which basically is an abstract representation of any kind of greeter. And then that will then we'll refer to just that interface, and then it'll be easy then to swap in happy greeter or friendly greeter because our application is not depending upon one or the other. It's open to any type of greeter. But then the question comes, well, if we don't mention the actual type of greeter in our application, how will our application know whether to use the happy greeter or the friendly greeter? So that's the big question. And so what we do here is we're going to have to find a way to inject the dependency at runtime, meaning once we say let's run this application, somewhere along the line, not within the application but somewhere outside with the application, there needs to be a way to say, okay, this time when you run this, we want to use the friendly greeter. But then maybe later, if you wanted to swap it out, again, not within the application, but somewhere outside the application, we could inject the other one in. Okay, so that's what we need to do, is we need to find a way to inject the dependencies at runtime. Okay, and that's why it's called dependency injection. How can dependency be injected into our application? We are going to use something called constructor injection. So we're going to have to remind ourselves what a constructor is, and it's inside that constructor we're going to set up our constructor in a certain way so that the constructor will be able to accept this, accept which one of these dependencies the application should use at any given time. So let's remind ourselves what a constructor is. Remember, if we have a class, let's just say we have a class called my class. What would a constructor look like? Well, remember, a constructor is going to be a method, but this is a special method. How do we know it's special? For one thing, it's called the same thing as the class itself. So even though my class is called my class, I have this method inside also called my class. So that's one way that you know this is a constructor. The method is called the same thing as the name of the class. The other way you know it is what also probably should look different to you, is that besides being named that way, it's also this is different. This is a different type of declaration of a method because it doesn't have a return type. Normally, if we had a method called my class, if we happen to have a method called that, which doesn't seem, obviously, it seems like a method wouldn't be called my class, but let's say we did have a method called my class. If we were to declare that or define that right here, we'd have to say public and then what return type it is, and then the name of the method. But here we don't have that. So a constructor never has a return type. It will just say public, and then it'll call the methods the same name as the name of the class. So a method with no return type but has the same name as the class, that will then is known as the constructor. So what's the constructor good for? Well, the statements inside a constructor is what is executed as soon as the class is instantiated. So if we have some, initialization things, kind of things to set up so that set up some properties maybe for a particular object based on the class or something like that, this is where we would do that. Okay, so just kind of some beginning things that are done, and again, it's just done the statements inside this constructor is just done only once as soon as an object is instantiated from the class. Now, however, what we want to do is we're trying to use what's called constructor injection. Remember, we want to be able to run our application and inside our application not mention a dependency at all, but we want something outside of the application to inject which of the greeters we would like to use, friendly greeter or happy greeter, right? So the way we can do this is our default controller. So it would be our home controller if our default controller is called home controller. We're going to create a constructor for that controller, but that constructor is going to have a parameter, and so it's the parameter there. So if we have here, just in this example, a constructor for this class called myClass. Again, it's a constructor because it's named the same thing as the class, but it doesn't have a return type. At the end of this, if we put some parentheses, then that would be where we would say what type of parameter we're expecting to have, and so we could put something in there. And so if we have some kind of parameter in there that would take which type of greeter we want, say, okay, this time when you run this application, pass in the friendly greeter. But maybe another time later we want to pass in the happy greeter. So that's how we can do it, is we set up a constructor that has a parameter, and that parameter then is going to allow us to send in the dependency that we want to use for any given case, any given time. So if we have a constructor set up that's going to accept the dependency, how then do we pass in the parameter if we're not wanting to write any code to do it? That's the big question. And here's how we do it. We create something called a dependency injection container. So this is something outside our application. It's going to act as a broker between the dependencies and the application itself. So think about this container, this dependency injection container, as basically just a list of interfaces that our application uses, along with which implementation we want to use for each interface. So it's just like a list. So for this Walmart greeter, we might want to, if we want to send in the friendly greeter, but we don't want to write any code within our application to say that, then we, inside this dependency injection container, we would list our interface of iGreeter, and then next to it we would say we want to use whichever one I said we wanted, the friendly greeter. Okay, so that's something outside our application, but it is telling our application will then look at it and say, okay, right now, which do you want me to use? Okay, so it acts as a broker between the dependencies and the application itself. So it's a list of interfaces along with which implementation should be used at this point. So our application then is only going to deal with interfaces. So when it talks about having a greeter, it's going to have a greeter of type iGreeter and not one of type friendly greeter or happy greeter. And so then when it comes time to, when we run the application and it comes time to instantiate an instance of our application, and that's what happens with home controller. When we run the application, an instance of home controller is created. When it comes time to do that, then what happens is our application says, okay, I need a dependency here and I don't know which one to use. So it goes to the dependency injection container and say, go check and see which type of implementation am I supposed to use for the iGreeter. And so it'll go and check, and if friendly greeter is listed there as the one to use, then our application will inject an instance of friendly greeter. If the other one is listed, then an instance of that one will be done. Okay, so it's this dependency injection container that's outside our application that is consulted by our application to say, okay, which one do you want me to use right now? Now, for dependency injection container, you can write your own if you want to, but there's ones that it involves a lot of code, and there are ones that are already created for us that are just easy to be able to use. So one of the types of DI containers that is possible to use is called Ninject, and that's the one that we're going to use for our dependency injection containers. I wanted to show you the website for ninject.org. Here's what it looks like when you first open it up. They have this little kind of like a ninja guy, and then down below, of course, it says download and some other things, contribute and so on. But I just wanted to show you what it says in the descriptions. There's this little carousel that down below that goes back and forth saying these different descriptions, and so I wanted to read those to you here. So here's the first one that it says, bend software to your will. Stop writing monolithic applications that make you feel like you have to move mountains to make the simplest of changes. Ninject helps you use the technique of dependency injection to break your applications into loosely coupled, highly cohesive components and then glue them back together in a flexible manner. Then it says, laugh in the face of change. Change is inevitable, so be prepared. Ninject allows you to embrace change in your software's design, so it will be easier to adjust it to match changing business needs and expectations. Then the next time someone asks for a small change to your application, you can laugh in triumph rather than quiver in pain. Write smarter software everywhere. Dependency injection isn't just for big enterprise applications. With the right framework, you can apply the practice to improve software projects of all sizes and types. Ninject was designed to be ultra lightweight and universal. It also runs practically anywhere, including on Mono, the .NET Compact framework, and blah blah blah. So that's not anything we're using, but anyway, the point is it runs anywhere. Be fast, be agile, be precise. Ninject makes dependency injection so easy that it becomes hard not to follow good practices. Once you start writing your applications with dependency injection in mind, your code will be easier to understand, easier to change, and less error-prone. Simply put, Ninject makes your application more ninja-like. So we need to learn how to use Ninject in order to add dependency injection within our applications. I've created this application that I've already talked about having to do with the Walmart greeter. I've created an application, it's out there on Canvas, and it's called Walmart Greeter No DI. That's first one. There's also another one where once we've added dependency injection. But first of all, if you want to follow along with me, and I really suggest that you do, go ahead and download and unzip the Walmart Greeter No DI from Canvas. So unzip that, open the project in Visual Studio, and you can go ahead and run it if you want to. It's going to work fine. All it does is just pull up a picture of a greeter, and we'll look at the details here in a minute. But it does not have dependency injection. So let's look and see what's inside there. So first of all, I have the friendly greeter class. It's similar to what I've already shown you in previous slides, but I've also added a string that's going to point to a picture that should be used for the friendly greeter. Okay, so I have two methods. One, say hi, and it says what he's going to say, he or she, and the image path method is going to return a string, and then within our view it's going to go out and find the corresponding image. Then for the happy greeter, I have also those same two methods, say hi and the image path, but say hi, he says something different and there's a different picture. Now inside the home controller I have a method called index. Let's see what it does. So the first thing that's done is an instance of the friendly greeter is created. Okay, so it says friendly greeter, my greeter equals new friendly greeter. So that's where we get our instance of this greeter, and it's going to be called my greeter from here on out, right? So then the next step, the next line says it's going to put whatever the greeter says on the right side of the equation. It says my greeter dot say hi. So what's going to happen is that method is going to be executed and a string will be returned. So whatever string is returned, that's put into what's on the left side of the equal sign, which is viewbag.greeting. Okay, so we're going to put the greeting into viewbag.greeting. Then the next statement on the right hand side, it's going to execute the image path method, and so that's going to go and find where the image is that should be displayed, and then we save the string that represents where that image is stored into the view bag for viewbag.theImagePath. Okay, so we have that, and then that's all we do is we set those things into the view bag, and then we go to the view. The view here, we say view with empty parentheses, meaning it's going to go and look for the view called the same thing as the method, so it would be looking for a view called index. So the index view looks like this. So really it's pretty simple. There's a heading in the H1 saying Walmart. Then inside the div it's going to show the image, and we haven't I don't think we have seen images yet within our application, so this is a good time to see how that's done. It's just an image tag, and then for the source we say where we want to find it. We had saved that path in our view bag, so that's why we mentioned the view bag there. And so it's going to show the image, and then it's also going to, in an H1 tag, it's going to give that greeting. So that's all it does, is it has an image and then some words. So if you run that application, it works just fine, but if you remember, there in the application we had that statement saying friendly greeter, my greeter equals new friendly greeter. We mentioned what type of greeter should be used, and that does not show dependency injection because we don't want anything within our application to mention which greeter should be used. And the reason why is we want these to be swapped out, be able to be easily swapped out independently without having to go into our application and make changes to that one line of code. So that one line of code that mentioned the friendly greeter, that's what tells us that this does not have dependency injection. Okay, so what we want to do is alter the project so that it does incorporate dependency injection. Now on Canvas I have 3 examples, and if you can go ahead and print those out, if you have a printer, that would be great, because what's really nice to do is to write this out first besides typing it, because it's going to be these different statements that we add and alter, and those at first just it seems kind of you know, do this, do this, do this. It seems like a lot that's going to be, you're going to have to remember. But when you look at it from example to example to example, you're always doing the very same thing. So what I wanted you to do is to see 3 different examples. And we're going to look at 3 different examples, one right after the other. And if you can take those, if you have it printed out, and go ahead and you're going to, with your pencil, mark out things and change things around like that. So if you can do that on your paper with your pencil, then I think it will help you, for one thing, practice changing this code like you need to. So you'll get the practice doing that, and plus it'll be on your paper so that you can go back and look at it when you have to do it again. So as opposed to just typing it into your application from the very beginning, and then which you will eventually do. But if you do that right away, then you kind of lose track of what you're doing. So I think these handouts would be good for you to have a copy of it and actually write down things as we're talking about them. So this first example here is the actual application that we've been talking about, the Walmart greeter application. So let's go through these 3 steps over to the right. Here are our first 3 steps that we need to do in order to accomplish dependency injection. These are the 3 steps that involve changing the code within a previously existing application. Okay, so the first step is to remove the original statement that created the object. So if you look down here for the first line in the index method, says iGreeter, myGreeter equals new friendly greeter. So we're creating an instance of the friendly greeter class, and it's called myGreeter. And then the next couple of statements are using this myGreeter. So again, it's going to take the myGreeter and run the say hi method, and also myGreeter and run the image path method. So we want to still be able to talk about this thing called myGreeter, but we don't want it to be specifically the friendly greeter. We want it to just be any type of greeter, not necessarily the friendly greeter. So the first step is to remove this one line that talks about the friendly greeter. So we will take that line, that top line there of index, and get rid of it. So you can cross it out, and we'll just put a line through it and say we're not going to have that line in there. Okay, and that helps because now we don't mention the friendly greeter. The problem, though, is that now the next few statements are talking about this thing called myGreeter, and we haven't even created it yet. So we need to fix that. So the next step is to add a declaration for that object at the top, and then somehow we're going to get an instance of that some way, in a different way. Okay, so see at the very beginning of this statement that we just crossed out, see that statement? We're going to, at the very beginning, we move it up. And so it's the first half, what's to the left of that equal sign in that statement that we just got rid of. We're going to put that up at the top right under the class, and we do have to add a semicolon there. So we're declaring a variable called myGreeter, and we're saying it's of type iGreeter. So the iGreeter, that's the interface, that's the more general idea, and we're not specifying that it's the friendly greeter or the happy greeter. Okay, so that the statement that you take out, before you take it out, realize that that first half of it is going to go up above, and then you add a semicolon after it. Okay, now the next step is to add a constructor that accepts the object as a parameter. So this is where we have to, there's no constructor already in here, and so we need to add the constructor, and this constructor needs to have a parameter that is going to be accepting the object that is instantiated some way outside our application. So how do we create a constructor? It's got to be the same name as the class. So if the class is home controller, then our method's going to be called home controller. It does not have a return type. So we're just going to say public home controller. Now we need to set this up so that it has a parameter. Okay, so now remember what we're doing is someplace outside of our application there's going to be an instance of one of these types of greeters. Okay, so it's that instance that needs to get sent in. So it's going to be of type iGreeter. We're saying open. It could be friendly greeter or happy greeter. So iGreeter, we'll call it, is the type. Now what do we want to call this? Now the name here is just kind of a temporary name, right? Because remember the scope of a variable of something of a parameter or any variable that's set up, if a private variable that's set up within a method, the scope is only going to be exist while the code is running within that method. Okay, so whatever code is in this constructor here, it's going to do something, but once that code is completed, whatever this is called is not going to be that viable anymore. So since it's kind of a temporary name, I'm just going to call it something like greeter passed in, meaning this gets passed in. We're temporarily calling it that, and somehow we need to be able to use it later. But for now, we're just going to call it greeter passed in. Okay, hopefully that makes sense so far. Now, we only need one statement inside this controller, and remember, our whole idea is we need to define or we need to initialize this myGreeter object. So far we've just declared it up above. We say we're going to have this thing called myGreeter, and we need to then actually say what it's equal to. So here's where our next step, we just say myGreeter, because again that's what we're going to call it from here on out. So that's not a private variable within this controller. It's because it's declared up above. So myGreeter is going to get set to whatever just got sent in. Okay, so if a friendly greeter instance gets sent in, then myGreeter is going to be a friendly greeter. If a happy greeter gets sent in, then myGreeter is going to be that. Okay, so that would be our constructor, and then we have done all we need to do for those first three steps of altering the code. Now there are more steps below on that worksheet, and those are the three steps that involve installing Ninject and getting Ninject to work. But what I want to do here first is make sure we really understand how to alter this code first before we go on and do that. So if you don't mind, we're going to stop. We're going to leave this example of the Walmart greeter, leave it aside for a minute, and go on to a couple of other examples with other code, just so that you can get this pattern down and so that you can see how it's the same thing that you're going to do no matter what. So let's go on and look at a couple of other examples as far as changing the code goes. Then we'll get back to the Walmart greeter and then learn how to complete it, get dependency injection actually working. Now let's go on to another example here quickly, just to see, so that you can see the pattern that is involved in changing the code in any application that you would be working on. So we'll leave the Walmart greeter aside for just a minute, look at a couple of other examples, see how changing the code is very similar. Then we'll come back to the Walmart greeter later when we're working on those last three steps. Okay, so the first step here, again, first of all, look at this at the very top. We're declaring an array of product objects. We would assume that somewhere else in the application we have a model class called product. Anyway, the first step again is to remove the original statement that created the object. So if you look down, the first statement in the index method is creating an object called calc, and it's going to be of type I-value calculator. So there would be an interface called I-value calculator somewhere else in the application. But then there's also this implementation of that interface, and it's called link value calculator. And so this is the statement we want to get rid of because we don't want our application to even be mentioning this link value calculator, because maybe there's another type of calculator we would want to bring in and use later. Okay, so we're going to get rid of that line. But then the next step is to add a declaration for the object at the top of the class. So again, we're going to take the first half of that statement there and put it up there at the top. Okay, so I-value calculator calc with a semicolon afterwards. So what that's going to do is declare that we're going to have this thing called calc. We'll say it's of type I-value calculator, so we're not specifying which actual implementation it is. Okay, so we've done that. Now the next step is to add a constructor that accepts the object as a parameter. Remember here that whatever we got rid of, it's this calc thing, this line that involves calc. We need to somehow set calc equal to something so that it can be used, because look, later in index we're talking about this thing called calc. So we need to set up our constructor so that after the statements are run within the constructor, there is this object called calc that can be used and referred to later. Okay, so the constructor here is going to have the same name as the class, no return type. It's going to have a parameter. What gets passed in? Well, it's something of type I-value calculator needs to get passed in. So let's say it's of type I-value calculator, and we'll call it something that's just a temporary name. We'll call it calc passed in, just to remind ourselves that it's just what's getting passed in to our constructor. And then inside we're going to say calc, which is what we really need to know about and use, because that's going to be mentioned down in our code below. Calc equals this thing that just got passed in. So then if that is run, then when we go on to the next line in index, when it's talking about calc, eventually there's actually an object that is instantiated, and it's called calc. And again, there's some more steps involved, because remember we haven't set this up at all so that something gets passed in to the home controller. And so those are the next three steps. But again, we'll wait for those next three steps and go on to even a third example. So again, you can see how this is done, and then eventually we'll get to those next three steps, those last three steps. Okay, third example here. We've got, I guess maybe we don't even have to look and see what it's doing, other than look down inside index and see that there's this thing being, for this statement here, it's I price calculator. It again is called calc, and it's in that the way it's written now, we're creating an instance of Black Friday sale price. So we will need to get rid of that. So our first step is remove the original statement that created the object. So that's the statement that's creating the object. We want to get rid of it because we don't want to mention Black Friday sales price, because maybe we want to swap that out with something else. So we're going to go ahead and get rid of that for that first step. Second step is add a declaration to the object at the top of the class. So that first half of the line that we just got rid of, we take that and put it up at the top and put a semicolon after it. So we have added a declaration of this thing called calc. We say it's going to be of type iPrice calculator, but we don't know, which implementation it is. And then the last step, add a constructor that accepts the object as a parameter. So again, here's the constructor. It's called home controller. What goes inside for the parameter? Well, it's going to be of type iPrice calculator, and we'll call it whatever, some temporary name. I'll call it calc passed in. Then our ultimate goal, though, is to have this object called calc to be able to use later on in our application. So we'll say calc equals this thing that just got passed in. Okay, so again, now we would have an object called calc that we could work with down below in our index method. And again, 3 more steps to come. We'll talk about those later. But hopefully you can see the pattern now. It's always just the same. Cross out one of the statements, put the first half of that statement up above and put a semicolon on it, then add a constructor and make sure that that constructor has something passed in that ends up getting set so that the rest of the code will work. Okay, so we've learned the first 3 steps, and now we need to learn those last 3 steps. So go ahead and watch the next video that's entitled Dependency Injection Part 2, and you'll learn then how to perform those next 3 steps.